Hello everyone. Well, a new patch has been out on global for a couple days now. I just didn't really have time to make a video immediately about it. I was busy finishing up that video we had about some of the Chinese patches. I kind of figured people are more interested in hearing about that. But I'll just do a quick recap here, even though I'm sure many of you have already pulled on this banner. So real quick, my general thoughts on this banner. Of course, if you're like me and you play protagonist a lot, you're going to love this banner. This was made for you. But I think following in the footsteps of a lot of the more recent characters they've released, they have relatively annoying bond requirements, and if you are newer or you don't have a large collection of characters, you might find that very bothersome unless you just happen to have the characters to bond them. Now the good thing is that both of these characters are offensive units, and Emperor Lovina uses Ares as his attack bond, and Saintess of the Ark uses Florentia as her attack bond, who are both fairly common units for people to pull for, regardless of what kind of faction they're focused on, because of how important they can be. So if you're not too obsessed with the defense bond, I actually think they can still be usable, even if you're not super into PvP or anything like that. I would say of the two, if you were going to pull for just one of them, as if you could choose or something, but it would probably be Emperor Lovina, because he has a faction buffer, and those units are always have a lot of potential. So speaking of Emperor Lovina, let's just talk about him real quick. So thankfully they were able to change the guy's name before they released him, and they didn't call him Lovina Emperor, as if suddenly the entire game was going to be written in Yoda speak or something. So like I said, if you are a protagonist player, this guy is pretty much a must pull. There's really no way around that. And if you're interested in Oboro in the future, you might want to consider getting him as well. Oboro's defense bond uses Emperor Lovina. Even if you don't play protagonist, I'd say this guy's still pretty good. Although there is such a mass of really strong units at this point. Tensei faction especially has so many good units to choose from. I don't think you need to be overly concerned with getting him. Strategic Masters still has the problem of their faction buffers being kind of weak. That's really the big problem they're facing. And the Strategic Masters buffer that is most commonly seen in PvP boxes right now, who is Ultimuller, he actually doesn't synergize that well with Emperor Lovina, if only because Emperor Lovina already has Terrain Master movement in his Cavalry class. Outside of his ability to faction buff, I don't think there's really a whole lot to say about Emperor Lovina. He is good at both single target and AoE, but one of the problems I have with him being able to do that is that his 3C is an AoE. So in the majority of games you see him being played, it is more an AoE focused type of strategy because it just feels more natural to play him as an AoE character since his 3C is already an AoE anyway. I mean, he's fine at single target too. He has Sword Soul and he has an Air Slash essentially. But since his 3C is essentially Sword Dance, since it heal blocks people, people do like running him with his 3C plus Sword Dance. It just makes him a really good initiator for AoE teams, because as someone who can cast heal block is always a really good setup. Aside from that, the most unique thing about Emperor Lovina is his talent, where he gets to reposition 2 units within 4 blocks of himself, up to 2 spaces from where they're standing. Now for PvE you might find this occasionally useful, but of course this is more tailored towards PvP, where moving your units around even a single block can mean a difference between victory and defeat. So he moves 2 units, 2 blocks, and then he himself will get +3 move at 6 stars. So this makes him feel more like a rush-oriented unit, because he's kind of setting up 2 of your team members plus boosting himself in movement at the same time, getting yourself ready for the next turn. Obviously this is a pretty strong ability when you place it alongside other movement boosters and all that. And of course if you move him last in a turn, you can do all kinds of shenanigans to make your opponent very confused as to what exactly your threat range is, and it's very easy to miscount blocks when you have more and more effects like this which shuffle your units around a little bit. And of course, since this is his talent and he uses it at the end of his turn, the nice thing is that he can cast his faction buff and then immediately use this on the first turn if you need that. So it isn't like some other units where it's like, if they cast a faction buff, that's all they have for their turn. You can cast a faction buff to set up your team and then move units to set up 2 other guys. So that's another reason why he's only heavily played in protagonist heavy boxes. If you don't have a lot of protagonist units, then of course you don't really need the faction buff. The biggest issue I would see with this deploying talent he has is that it moves the unit themselves rather than boosting their movement. So if you're locked into some kind of zoning wars against an opponent who also has very high movement range, then his deploying talent might not necessarily be useful because you can't really deploy your units forward without also placing yourself in danger. So this does have that limitation compared to other units who can set up using some kind of movement boost. Nevertheless, being able to reposition your units even after they've acted is a pretty big deal. It can also help you mitigate some luck-based things, like if your opponent gets a breeze when you were hoping they didn't, you can also use this to kind of move them out of the way. So there's all kinds of applications you can do with this deploy talent, and it's really the main feature this guy has other than the protagonist faction buff, I think. Everything else is, it's good. You know, like I said, he's pretty good at both AoE and single target. but there are other units that can do those things just as well, if not better. Another thing I feel the need to point out is his AoE range. It's actually pretty bad. His 3C is only a 2 block around himself, and the Sword Dance, of course, is just 1 ring. So a lot of times, if you're running this guy and you want a respectable range with him, you do want to be running Balance Blade. And of course, that also limits your options. Obviously, running Balance Blade will make his single target a lot weaker as well. Although, generally speaking, there's really no reason he shouldn't be able to kill most DPS opponents using a Sword Soul or something if you really needed to. Of course, he's probably not going to be killing any more tanky units like Lewin, and he's probably not going to be tank busting most of the time. And that's just another reason why you would see him be played in AoE teams a lot more than single target ones. Of course, there's also the option to go a hybrid team where you have some AoEs and some single target, and he works pretty well there as well. And I guess the final thing worth mentioning is he does have the 1C Indomitable Revive skill. Of course, this is going to be when he runs in 1C most of the time, but nowadays there are just so many units that can kill through revives or disable your passives or something. It's not as powerful of a passive as it used to be, even though it's still really good. His other 1C option is essentially a move again that has a defense bonus, which is really not that impressive in my opinion. So that's just another reason that he would probably be running the 1C Indomitable instead of something else. But yeah, in summation, protagonist faction, pull him for sure. Everyone else, you can think about it, but he's not really necessary. If you want to get Oboro later, then you should consider it because he is a defense bond on that guy. So now let's move on to Saintess of the Ark. So I personally think Saintess of the Ark is pretty bad, and when I say bad, I mean in relative terms. She is a debuff AoE character, and she's very similar to bozel. She does do quite a few debuffs. She does 1 debuff from her talent, 2 debuffs if she's transformed, and mostly AoEs you're going to use from her will also deal 2 random debuffs, so usually she's dealing about 5 debuffs. So around the same level as bozel, but I do think she is worse than bozel for a number of reasons. First, the most obvious thing is that bozel has the Dark Faction buff. Faction buffs are of course always useful. Bozel has that 3C where he can spam it, where he gets to cast like 4 AoEs in a row. He gets to do his 3C, and then his 3C again, and then Black Hole, and then 3C again. And then after that, if you have clocks, you can just keep going if you get lucky. Now to be fair, Saintess of the Ark does have a mechanic built into her that functions kind of similarly. When her transform ends, all her cooldowns are reduced by 3. So you can transform the first turn, cast 1 AoE after that, and then cast like her 3C or something after that. And then she'll do her end of transform AoE, after which she gets cooldown -3. So your cooldowns are pretty close to being ready again after all of that. So in that sense, her ability to spam AoEs isn't necessarily worse than bozel. And unlike bozel, she does have a line AoE, which is a very nice option. Usually that does have better range than the span AoEs in terms of trying to fight against Rush or something. But ultimately my problem with Saintess of the Ark is that she has all these limitations compared to bozel, and really not that much more that she offers above him, other than the fact that she has different factions. Like I said, she has no faction buff, which is already a huge loss in utility. She can't build magic defense like bozel can, which makes bozel very tanky against certain enemies. And because of the way bozel is usually built, he can be fairly tanky against physical as well. I mean, she has to waste one of her enchant stat slots, as it were, for intelligence to be able to do decent damage. So you'll end up probably enchanting for HP and intelligence on her, as opposed to bozel, where you get the double dip. You can enchant HP and magic defense, and if you're lucky, you'll get some defense as well. Saintess of the Ark also has weaker troop choices than bozel. Bozel does have a Lancer troop, which is very useful against certain comps. There's a fair number of cavalry in the meta right now, and being able to run Stone Colossus can save you against a lot of them. Saintess of the Ark only gets Sorceresses, Crystal Warlocks, Dark Alchemists, which are okay, I guess. But yeah, when you look at all this, it just feels like she is a worse bozel. Basically, I think Saintess of the Ark has 2 main gimmicks she has that bozel does not have. First, she has this weird transform thing where when it's about to end, she will lock herself in place, be very difficult to kill, and then she'll just kind of explode and do a bunch of debuffs to everyone, including your allies, within a certain range. So it's the 4 lines adjacent to her. There actually is a limit to how far it goes. It actually goes, I think, 10 blocks out of her, which is usually enough to cover the entire map, but it's still worth noting that there is a limit. Now, this as a gimmick is kind of funny because it also hits your guys, and I guess it could kind of disrupt your opponent's formation when you're trying to get out of the way. But generally speaking, I feel like this gimmick is all flash and no substance. Like I said, Saintess of the Ark isn't particularly tanky, so to get to the point where she even gets to use this in the first place, there's a lot of fast-paced games going on right now. I just don't see it happening that often. And even when it happens, it's probably not that impressive. It's basically just another AoE, really. It is a very strong AoE, and it does 3 random debuffs. But as I mentioned, your opponent can actually get out of the way of this thing. Her second gimmick comes from her 3C, which allows her to convert enemy holy heroes into demons. So this AoE is a 5 range, 3 line AoE, so it has an okay range, but this is just such a narrow effect, converting enemy holy units into demons, and Saintess of the Ark herself doesn't even have a holy class anyway. So the only way you would be able to take advantage of this is if you use this AoE and then also have a holy unit on your side. I also feel I need to mention that the most common holy unit in the meta right now is probably Sherry, and she will kill Saintess of the Ark very easily before she is anywhere near reaching her. So overall, my impression on Saintess of the Ark is still mostly negative. It's not that her kit could never work. It's very similar to bozel, and bozels can still win games quite often, actually, if you get into the right situation. But the obvious question that follows that is, why would I put Saintess of the Ark into my box instead of bozel, who can faction buff and then also pretty much do the same roles she has while also being tankier? In fairness, Saintess of the Ark has a slightly higher attack range than bozel, I believe, and they could probably both safely run Breeze at this point. And as mentioned, Saintess of the Ark does have different factions. She's protagonist and princess. Mythical is a shared faction with bozel, but Mythical likes to take a lot of these debuff characters anyway. But the thing about a lot of these debuff characters is that they can often function just fine even without a buff. Especially bozel, who you only really need to bring a magic defense buff for if you really wanted to. Saintess of the Ark is a more traditional character where you want to buff her intelligence, her defense, and her magic defense if you want her to be running at max capacity. I think it says something when even players like myself, who are purely into protagonists, look at this character and just like, I'm not really sure I'm going to put her in my box. I will probably play around with her a little bit, and as far as protagonists go, she's a pretty unique addition because protagonists didn't have any crazy debuffers like this yet. So yes, if you are pure protagonists like me, then sure, go ahead and get her, and she will be a unique addition. But once again, sound like a broken record, I just don't see any reason most players would be using her over bozel. I think she is definitely one of the characters who is a candidate for a really good exclusive equipment at some point, because as she is right now, she is just very underwhelming. Not unusable, like I said. She's a debuff character. Those are usually good no matter what. It's just that she is so outclassed by all debuff characters that already exist. I already mentioned bozel. Even looking at some of the characters we have in the meta right now who are AoE debuffers, Kruger of course has his shield and pretty good striking range. Cortez has pretty good striking range and some unique abilities of his own. King of Red Moon can revive, teleport around, lower healing amount, which is sometimes better than heal block because it can't be immunized against. Licorice has really great off-healing capabilities, which is another thing I find really funny, is that Saintess of the Ark is somehow a grown-up Licorice and she has mastered her powers, as it were, but for some reason she lost all her abilities to heal, I guess. Even someone like Transcender, who is not super popular, I think he has a couple unique gimmicks to him. Some very strong AoEs and that ability to attack twice and get a shield on himself. I'm just really not seeing any good reason to be putting Saintess of the Ark on your team, even if you were whole into debuffs. Your box is probably overflowing with options at this point, and I just don't see what Saintess of the Ark offers that is unique compared to a lot of those other guys. But hey, once I've sharded her up a bit myself, I'll be trying her out. Maybe I'll change my mind on her, but I doubt that's going to happen until she gets an exclusive equipment. I'm expecting something that will change her at least a little bit, or at least give her something unique to do. Okay, so now let's look at the exclusives real quick. We have Sissi White and Listell. Sissi White is incredible. It is very, very strong. People who played with Sissi White already knew this was coming, and I think they've been waiting for it for a while. If you use her, you absolutely should get this. It boosts the number of tokens she gets every single turn, and I think that's pretty self-explanatory. The other one is Listell's Helm, and this one is just not very impressive. I think the majority of people who are using Listell were putting Njord's Crown on her. This is barely even a side grade. It actually has worse defenses, 5% less, although the trigger is arguably easier to satisfy. The extra debuff is always nice if you still use her as a debuffer, and it's a relatively unique debuff, so it can be good at overwhelming an opponent. But honestly, usually when you pick Listell in PvP, for the few people that still use her, usually you're playing the kind of game where if Listell gets in a range and she casts her 3C, you've pretty much won the game already. Listell's biggest problem right now is her low movement, which this obviously doesn't help with at all. It's an okay helm, but it's kind of similar to something like Rosalia's sword, where it's like, it's okay. If you're short on controllers, which I think a lot of people are, I would not waste my time with it. Not unless they add SP Listell someday, and then you'll have to raise this, but just get them when that happens, I guess. Okay, so they also added 2 new soldiers here, which actually kind of surprised me. I think some people, including myself, were actually partially expecting them to add 4 soldiers again, because they usually have this thing where they combine 2 months worth of updates and then patch them into the game at the same time. And because of that, in the past they've done patches where they add 4 soldiers at once. So because of that, we are actually only getting the Siege Ballista and the Mechanical Dragon Knights this month. We did not get what I believe is the Zombies and the Gold Knights, which I'm sure is disappointing many Epsilon players. I am under the impression they did this specifically because in about 2 weeks we are going to enter another playoffs, and they didn't want Epsilon to have zombies for those playoffs. That's the only assumption I can make, because otherwise they've usually crunched 4 soldiers into one patch and then skipped the soldiers for another patch. But whatever the case, we got what we got. So Siege Ballista are pretty much a straight power creep over catapults, I think. I mean, not entirely straight power creep. There are some very fringe situations where they are worse, but pretty much any situation you would be using catapult, you would want to use Siege Ballistas instead. Just like with catapults, they only increase normal attack range. So these are most useful on units that kind of stay in one place and might want the extra range once in a while, and obviously the main character I would say that this applies to is young Jessica. I think for the rest of the units, this is just a nice archer option. Although it is worth remembering that these guys are 3 move, so for some of these units they are lowering their movement. For example, if I wanted TRs to be able to shoot down a flyer for some reason, then these are significantly stronger than what she had available before, which is like Demon Hunter and Bolt Rangers. But these do root her down to 3 movement, which is a big problem. They're also nice on some of these healers that have boosted soldier stats, like Sissi White, Florentia, and Wheeler all have them. It might also be nice for Egbert for PvE purposes, when you want to chip away at something with fixed damage. But yeah, even though it is a pretty good soldier, I think most people are going to skip building these only because their applications are so narrow. I think for a lot of people, including myself, they're going to put these on the back burner and only raise them when you have a lot of extra materials after you're done raising a bunch of other stats and soldiers that you still need to raise. Like I said, I think the only unit that is anywhere near necessitates the raising of this soldier is probably young Jessica. So the other one we got was Mechanical Dragon Knight, and these are really good, even though they look very narrow in usage. So basically, they have 25% increased attack and defense all the time, so there's no HP requirement or anything like that. And when you are attacked with a melee attack, you take reduced physical damage, or rather the soldiers take reduced physical damage. Now that might sound very narrow. You have to be attacked, it has to be melee, and it has to be physical. But honestly, that is actually really useful for a number of units. If you raised Emperor Lovina, of course, this is going to be one of his mainstay soldiers. He doesn't have that many other options. I mean, he does have unicorns, but he doesn't need to use them because he has Terrain Master movement anyway. So using flyer troops allows him to run over stuff as needed. They are pretty nice for units that were already tanky to begin with. For example, Altamiller or Emmerich, or even Toa. They are a really nice option for when you get into a matchup where you're like, oh, I'm going to be facing a lot of physical opponents. Not as much reason to not be using these over something like Steel Wings. Now, Steel Wings and Griffin Knights actually do have a higher attack bonus than these guys, but the nice thing about the Mechanical Dragon Knights is that they have the attack and defense plus 25% all the time, even on enemy phase. And like I said, they have no HP requirement, so that makes them a lot more flexible in general usage. For someone like Matthew or Emmerich, obviously their other option is usually Angels, and I think the choice between the two are obvious. Like if you're facing a lot of magic units, then you use Angels, and if you're facing a bunch of physical units, then you use these. They can also be occasionally good on Luna if you like to send her forward to just put one God Realm up and just want to protect her against being one-shot by things. Usually people use Bolt Rangers for that, but these are also a good option sometimes. And I kind of brushed over it, but there are a number of other tanky units here that do enjoy the extra physical tankiness. Angelina is a tanky unit. Ashram is a fairly tanky unit, and he also strikes first on enemy phase, which can be useful. So bottom line is that pretty much all these units have something that is slightly better in some regard, or is much better in some other situation, but I think these are still a really good troop to raise because I don't think it's actually that uncommon to run into situations where you want enemy phase output, or you want to be able to tank a physical melee hit for some reason, or you just want to be able to be at a lower HP percentage and still be able to get okay output from your soldiers. Because, for example, Griffin Knights and Angels, once they drop below a certain HP percentage, Griffin Knights especially, they drop below that 80% threshold very easily. They just become a bunch of paper planes and they can't do anything. These Mechanical Dragon Knights have very consistent performance, no matter what HP percent they're at. Obviously, I mean, their performance still goes down because you lose soldiers, but they still have the attack and defense bonus. So for me personally, I've actually already maxed these guys out. I think I'm going to get plenty of use out of them, so if you use any of these heroes, I would certainly think about raising them. Okay, so now let's just talk about some of the content and miscellaneous stuff they added in no particular order. So first we have the new time rift, a bunch of scrolls, a bunch of crystals. There's also a King's Crown as one of the hidden treasures in one of the stages, so if you really need those still, be sure to do this time rift. Otherwise, not much to say here. Enjoy the Wikigrisser 5 story. So next we have a third covenant added now. It's Heimdall. Now looking at the bonus stats real quick, I'll put them on screen. What you'll immediately notice, of course, is that Heimdall has a significant amount of HP and defense bonus to your units, as opposed to Thor, who is a little bit more well-balanced, and Frigg, who is more intelligence-based. I think the main takeaway from this is that since you are able to change your covenant after pick ban, I do think Heimdall will have some very narrow use if you just happen to be playing a very tanky turtle game and you want your guys to survive assassins, or you want your tank to live through physical attacks longer. Heimdall is an option, but for the most part, I don't think a lot of you need to stress out too much about clearing the Heimdall stages as soon as possible. Although, of course, it's worth remembering that each covenant unlocks the next one, so if you want to be able to unlock the future covenants, you do have to do the Heimdall one eventually. I do think that was kind of a design flaw from Salone's part, but honestly, going forward, I think you'll be fine if you just have Thor. Everything else is a side grade. Even Frigg is a side grade. People use Frigg when they have Kyra as their main carrier or something like that. This is talking just about PvP, of course, because in that case, you're just looking at the stats. As far as PvE goes, they've done a pretty good job differentiating each of the covenants. There is a good reason to be using each of them. Thor, of course, does a lot of fixed damage. Frigg does increase your range and does some AoE and magic damage. So this time we have Heimdall, whose focus is on reducing the damage you take and also healing you. He has a command that heals you. Anytime you heal people, you get more stacks on him. All of these covenants has some kind of stacking mechanic to them. So he gives you a bunch of damage shields, and then he can use an AoE that reduces the opponent's attack, and this cannot be resisted, so this is probably going to work on most bosses as well. And then his single target move is actually not a single target attack or anything like that. It is actually a buff on one of your units that increases the damage they deal based on how many stacks you built on Heimdall. There's actually been a couple really funny clips I've seen where people just stack a shitload of stacks on Heimdall, and then they power up one unit and they're strong enough to one-shot one of the dragons or something. It's fun if you want to make a little joke video with Heimdall, and it can be very useful if you have one particular unit that you've raised that's much stronger than your other ones. But I think the main use of Heimdall is to make sure if you are a player that likes to focus a lot on healing and you need to break past a certain turn in a challenge where there's a lot of heal blocks and stuff going around, Heimdall will be your covenant of choice in that case. But yeah, that's Heimdall. I think so far they've done a pretty good job of making each of them have a unique role and do something slightly different for the team. So definitely, if you want more options, both for PvE and for your stats in PvP, make sure to raise this guy. In Floating City, they didn't add a lot. They added the Clock Tower. This just gives you extra Clock of Forgiveness charges. If you do not have the Clock of Forgiveness already, it gives you 1 charge for most of its levels, and if you max it out, you get 2 charges. I think for people who already have the Clock of Forgiveness, this is just really overboard. You didn't need another 6 charges or whatever on your Clock of Forgiveness, even though I guess it lets you be even lazier and be even more careless when you're clearing maps, but I think this is mostly for free-to-play players. This now means you have either 1 or 2 clock charges, and this can significantly change the way you approach a lot of challenges. So yeah, this is definitely one building I would highly recommend that free-to-play players get, especially because obviously 1 charge is a really big difference over having 0 charges. For people who already buy it, having 15 charges over 9 charges is really not that big of a difference. We have Dimensional Expedition running again. It's already running even as I'm recording this. There's really not a whole lot to say here. It's not any different from last time, really. At least it didn't overlap it with playoffs weekend, I guess, but yeah, have fun with all the Guild Wars stuff. Okay, so the quality of life changes, I think, are probably some of the biggest ones for this patch. They changed some of the menus so that you can access certain menus easier now. For example, you can access the Secret Realm from the front page of the Floating City now, which is very nice. Should have been there in the first place, but whatever. Class materials can be bought infinitely now from your guild store. This is long awaited. It's really crazy that they waited this long to remove that limit. But the weekly limit for buying Heartbond items is still there, so that's kind of annoying. But whatever, take what you can get, I guess. Hopefully they will unlock that eventually as well. You can now filter by faction in the bond interface, and you can see the characters you've most recently bonded. You cannot sweep it, quick sweep the characters just yet. I showed that in the last video talking about the Chinese server. We are going to get that in the next patch or two, but for now you still have to click each one of them, even though you don't have to scroll through the entire hero roster anymore. Baby steps from along as far as quality of life changes go. Okay, finally I want to talk about one really big thing that I think some people might have overlooked, and it's the fact that the black market is cheaper now. This just adds another thing that you need to go and check every now and again. And it's not that big a deal, I think, for most players, but if you are an endgame player, or even a mid-game player possibly, you do want to check the black market once in a while now, because the enchant scrolls are significantly cheaper now and much, much more worth buying. Obviously, don't get like too bad of FOMO and be like, oh no, I have to obsessively check it every time it refreshes. Although I do believe there is an option for notifications for when the black market resets. So you can try to turn those on if you're so inclined, although it's been kind of inconsistent for me for how often it works properly. But yeah, this is actually a pretty important change as far as enchanting goes, because even before they reduced the price, it was kind of worth getting the SSR scrolls, especially if it was like Breeze or something. But now that the price is like it's like a third of what it used to be or something like that, it's way cheaper. Definitely go check the black market when you log in. See if there's anything you want to buy. I think this is a good change. I mean, it was kind of weird that the black market was practically useless beforehand. They've also added some new items to it, like some of the Heartbond items and Angan automatons, but a lot of these cost crystals, which for free-to-play players, that's kind of pointless. For Mega Whales, maybe you want to buy them if you're lazy, especially with the automatons, but yeah, it's just another thing for you to check when you log in. Like I said, don't feel that bad if you forget about it, because it's not that big of a difference, because at most you'll get maybe like 2 or 3 scrolls from it every single day if you check obsessively. So it's really not that big of a difference. And obviously you're not guaranteed the scroll type that you actually want, which is usually Breeze or like Clock or something. So finally, some other things to look forward to this month. We're probably going to get another Secret Realm event next week, or next Thursday. It's a pretty standard Secret Realm event, nothing much to say there. We're going to see Suzette on a Destiny banner. If you really want Suzette, you can pick her up there. We are maybe going to see a rerun of Record of the Lodos War. Obviously, that's not guaranteed. With collabs, it's always kind of hit or miss. We don't know if we're going to get them at the exact same time. But if we do get it, then my only real recommendation is that obviously you do the event and get Parn for free, you get Pure Test for free. Free units are nice. But of the 2 banner characters, Ashram and Deedlit, the only character I would recommend getting at this point is probably Deedlit. And she's not super important or anything like that, but she is still very good. She's still decent enough in PvP, and in PvE she is very good in Jormungandr. I think she's pretty much the only collab unit that has been a significant influence on one of the Ancient Beckoning fights, or any PvE fight in general. Although I guess there's like Iris for Fenrir, or Olivier for Fenrir. But I think a lot of top tier teams don't use those 2 anymore, as opposed to Deedlit, who still finds a place on even the best teams for Jormungandr still. And Deedlit's just a pretty good unit in general. And hey, it's Record of Lodos War, it's a cool series, and Deedlit is a cool character, so that's another reason to be getting her. Anyway, ran through stuff kind of quick here and a little bit late, but I do want to try my best to still review the patches as they come out. But hopefully I'll be uploading a video in a week or 2 where I talk about Valkyria Chronicles collab on China. But until then, I'll be seeing you guys.